Justice, Equity, Diversity, and
This meeting is being recorded.
Thank you. I am the Senior Manager of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiatives for the Rock Creek Conservancy. The Rock Creek Conservancy is a watershed organization protecting Rock Creek, and we are also the philanthropic and stewardship partner to the entirety of Rock Creek National Park. The Conservancy's mission is to restore Rock Creek and its parklands as a natural oasis for all people to appreciate and protect. In my role as Senior Manager of JEDI Initiatives, I lead the coordination of the Conservancy's Race History and Rock Creek programming. The history of our national parks, and Rock Creek Park in particular, as it sits in our nation's capital, encompasses people of all races and all walks of life. The National Park Service and the Rock Creek Conservancy have partnered to tell the stories from the intersection of race, history, and Rock Creek. Through this ongoing series of programming, we will be exploring different historical events and different historical locations throughout Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please consider joining us for a future event this fall. We're going to have another one in November. And at the end of this event, I will also share some information and a link to our Race History and Rock Creek page, where you can see our entire archive of recorded race history and Rock Creek events from the past. So we do record all of these events and have a wonderful library of archived events on our website. Tonight's event is titled Civil Rights in Meridian Hill / Malcolm X Park. We will hear from local historians and experts as we explore the history of the park, how it has been used to support social activism, and how the space continues to serve as a hub for cultural activities. It is my honor to introduce Brian Joyner, Deputy Superintendent of Rock Creek Park with the National Park Service. Brian is a resource management professional with extensive experience in engaging communities, working collaboratively with internal and external partners in managing complex projects. Recently, he has directed change management activities to move the organization in line with current best practices. He has a strong background as a writer and editor and has published on multiple topics, including historical preservation, public history, and popular culture. So again, thank you so much, Brian, for joining us tonight. And Brian will now introduce our panelists.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight representing the park. And representing those of us who are from Washington, D.C., as many of the people on this call are, this webinar. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Jocelyn Imani. Dr. Imani is the National Director for Black History and Culture for the Trust for Public Lands. Dr. Imani is a storyteller, an educator, a community builder with over a decade of experience as a public historian. And she joined as the national director of the Black History and Culture program in 2022. In her work, she's focused on reimagining how Black history and culture sites are activated and aims to make shared spaces more relevant and accessible to all populations. Prior to joining TPL, Dr. Imani spent time as an interpretive ranger with the National Park Service. She served as a historian at the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. She worked for the Office of Curatorial Affairs at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. She's taught history at Fisk University and Howard University, as well as Washington Adventist University, Coppin State University, and a few other places as well. She's a very busy person. She is particularly dedicated to the development of strong children, a passion reflected in her founding of the Big Brown Get Down, an annual community event that connects upwardly mobile professionals with middle and high school age students from underserved communities. Dr. Imani holds a PhD in African diaspora and public history from Howard University and a BA in history from Fisk University. She's an avid fan of the arts, music, and culture. Dr. Imani comes from a long line of musicians and sang before she spoke. Proud daughter of the South, she is a native of Nashville, Tennessee. The other panelists, unfortunately, will not be able to be here in person, but has provided a video that we'll be watching shortly. That is Elise Norquist. She's a historian with Dovetail Cultural Resource Group. She is based out of Richmond, Virginia. She was a panelist on a previous Race History in Rock Creek event about Meridian Hill. And as a research historian, Elise contracted with the Organization of American Historians to complete studies for the National Park Service published works, including Meridian Hill Special Resource Study, the African American Experience since the Civil War, Catoctin Mountain Park, Administrative History Update, Henry Farm, a Cultural Resource Inventory, Manassas Battlefield Park, Georgetown Area, Chesapeake and Ohio National Historical Park Cultural Landscape Inventory, and the Wolf Trap National Historic Park for the Performing Arts Administrative History Update. She recently began working as a historian in the private sector. I'll give it back to you now, Tony.
All right, thank you so much. So as Brian said, Elise wasn't able to join us in person tonight, but she was nice enough to pre-record a presentation. It's about 15 minutes long, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And this is, Elise provides some great historical background. She's got some great maps and other figures that she will show during her presentation. And she's really going to sort of set the stage for the conversation that Brian and Jocelyn will be having during the discussion part of this event. So without further ado, here's Elise.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Elise Norquist, and I have worked for the past few years as a historian. My background is in archaeology. But as I said, I've been working as a historian for several years doing research for the National Park Service through the Organization of American Historians. One of my projects that I worked on was the Meridian Hill Park Special Resource Study, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. This is the second round of it, and to start off, I'm actually going to give you some background about what we talked about before. So right now, I'm going to transfer over and show a slideshow. During the last presentation, I discussed how the land where Meridian Hill Park on Malcolm X Park is located was used before its establishment, as well as the development and early use of the park. Before jumping into today's section, I will provide a brief summary of what was discussed. So before the land that became Meridian Hill Park was developed, it was located outside of the original city limits of Washington City, and it was located in Washington County. In the late 18th century, this area was rural and a mix of large land holdings or plantations worked by enslaved laborers, and there were also small freeholds and tenant farms. The name Meridian Hill arose in the early 19th century. At the time, it was thought that 16th Street, which was then Meridian Avenue, was the prime meridian of the city of Washington. So Commodore Porter, who was the landowner at the time, he named his estate Meridian Hill. During the Civil War, Porter's Meridian Hill estate was requisitioned by the Union Army. The mansion was used as a temporary hospital, and the land was used as an encampment for various Union regiments. Similar to other Union camps that were located both inside and outside of the city, freedmen and escaped African Americans found food, shelter, and work at Camp Cameron. After the war, an African American community developed near Camp Cameron in the northeast section of modern-day Meridian Hill Park. Beginning in the late 19th century, a woman named Mary Henderson, she was the wife of a former Missouri senator, and she was a Washington socialite, began to buy land in the area. She had plans to develop it into an elite community with mansions for foreign embassies. She also wanted to develop 16th Street, again, which was called Meridian Avenue, into something on par with the Champs-Élysées in Paris. As part of her efforts, she lobbied Congress for the development of the park that was proposed in the 1901 Macmillan Plan. By November 1912, all of the buildings on Meridian Hill were scheduled to be razed. And these buildings were the African American community that consisted of about 35 buildings. The residents there were primarily renters, though some did own their homes. By 1923, the upper portion of the park was open to use, and by 1936, the entire park was complete. Originally, the park was not under the management of the National Park Service, but then when it did fall under the management of the NPS, the park was not segregated. There were actually numerous non-segregated events held in the park, including the Starlight Chamber Music Series, which was held by the park by the reflecting pool during World War II. While Meridian Hill Park was not segregated, there were discriminatory practices in place across the district in public places such as restaurants, hotels, theaters, and places of employment. Growing racial tensions came to a head in the summer of 1919, and race riots ensued in 25 cities across the country, including Washington, D.C. In response to this increase in racial hostility, Black Washingtonians began to coalesce in the Shaw or Greater U Street area, which is located south of the park. By 1930, U Street became the community's main corridor, known nationally as Black Broadway. So in Columbia Heights, which is a neighborhood adjacent to Meridian Hill Park, the Columbia Heights Citizens Association actually began to gather signatures on petition covenants or restrictive covenants, which put restrictions on who could buy houses in the area. And this effectively restricted African Americans from buying in this area. And from this map, you can see that there were restrictive covenants in place largely to the north and east of Meridian Hill Park. So in the 1930s, the African American communities were primarily west of 13th Street, and in the Adams Morgan, Shaw, and that was actually east of 13th Street, and in the Shaw and Greater U Street area, as well as Adams Morgan. Sentiments towards housing segregation began to shift in the 1940s, and in 1948, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the case of Heard versus Hodge against racially restrictive covenants. After this ruling, African Americans began to move across that 13th Street barrier into what was previously a predominantly white area in Columbia Heights. Now on this, we can see the demographics changing once that ruling was made. The integration of the all-white Central High School, which is now Cardozo High School, in 1950, as well as the ruling of the court in the Brown versus Board of Education case, also served as an impetus for the exodus of white families. And the demographics of Columbia Heights also reflect this shift. And from these chargements were made from a great organization. You can see that the community surrounding Meridian Hill Park increased, the African American population increased after that ruling. So in the 1960s, the neighborhoods surrounding Meridian Hill Park began to suffer crime and poverty, and this influenced use of the park. University Place, which is located a block to the east of the park, actually led the district in crime in the mid-1960s. There was a neighborhood council called the University Neighborhood Council based out of Howard University, and they sought to bring life back to the park. And they did this through establishing a concert series which ran in the summers of 1963, 1964, and 1965. This council, in cooperation with the National Park Service and the DC Recreation Department, also sponsored an Art in the Park series in 1966. So they were really trying to get people back into the park, and another way this was done was through the Summer in the Parks program. And in 1968, that is when the National Park Service initiated the program, and the kickoff party was actually held at Meridian Hill Park, attended by over 20,000 people. All right, so the proximity of several largely African American communities, which we saw on the previous slides, attracted Black Washingtonians to the park. And in 1965, after the assassination of Malcolm X, African Americans gathered at the park to commemorate his death. And this is actually when the drumming circle that still is taking place in the park today was first formed. It was actually formed by a man named Baba Ngoma. He is the house drummer at Howard Theater, and he initiated the drumming circle, which became a weekend fixture. And as he later said in a newspaper article, it was an expression of Black consciousness during the height of the civil rights. After the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., that Black nationalists and other groups began to gather at the park. And as we can see from this map, the park was in close proximity to several groups, including the Black United Front. There is also the Community Center for the Black Panthers and several other groups that are not shown on this slide. In 1969, the Black United Front held a rally at the park, and it was during this rally that the park was renamed from Meridian Hill Park to Malcolm X Park. A congressman named Adam Clayton Powell of Harlem actually tried to introduce a bill in Congress to rename the park, but the bill was not reenacted because Meridian Hill Park already has a memorial to President James Buchanan, and therefore the park cannot be named for anyone else. So over the years, the park continued to be used as a place for celebration as well as protest. There were numerous African American groups that gathered in the park, and this is just a list of a few of them. One of the groups was actually the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which was formed in 1971 by Stokely Carmichael. And they actually held numerous rallies at the park to protest the South African apartheid and other issues that were relevant to Africans. They also organized the African Liberation Day. So the use of Meridian Hill Park over the years has reflected what has been going on in the district. Beginning in the 1970s, developers began to renovate homes in the area. And in the 1990s, the district actually began to work with developers to revitalize the district. These developers demolished public and low-income housing and invested in mixed-income housing and more affluent neighborhoods. Demographics began to shift, and the once primarily African-American city of Washington, D.C. began to be gentrified. And these two following tables can show that shift in demographics. So despite these demographic changes in the district and surrounding neighborhoods, Meridian Hill Park, or Malcolm X Park, continues to be a public space and rallying forum for African Americans. More recently, in 2012, approximately 100 Howard University students protested the failed shooting of Florida teenager Trayvon Martin. In 2013, a prayer vigil was held in the park after the court ruled in favor of Martin's shooter. Another rally was held in 2016 after the shooting of several African American men in Louisiana and Minnesota, and this is just a few examples. And in regard to that drumming circle that I mentioned earlier, it continues today, but in a different form. Ngoma, as mentioned earlier, told the Washington Post recently, quote, "When it started out, it was more of a sacred thing. It was a cultural expression and it had a religious connotation. Now sometimes it is very driving and motivating, and other times it is a bunch of cacophony," end quote. Another member of the circle who was part of it for more than 40 years told the Washington Post that the circle was, quote, "good therapy for African Americans, and it was spiritual for me. Now I feel a little beat down at the circle, ignored," end quote. So the drumming circle has been affected by gentrification. And actually in the summer of 1999, petitions were submitted, one of them calling for placing a curfew on the circle, and the other calling for banning the drumming circle altogether. In 2000, the U.S. Park Police actually evicted the drumming circle from its long-held space along 15th Street on the Columbia Heights side of the park, moving them to the 16th Street or Adams Morgan side. So despite this friction, the circle has grown and adapted, and many longtime neighborhood residents still though feel that the park has changed significantly. In conclusion, Meridian Hill Park, or Malcolm X Park, is a microcosm of the district. The park's development and design, as well as its various uses, reflect the changing social and political climate of the city. Today, as the neighborhood has transitioned into a more multi-ethnic, multiracial community, the park has been defined by new attitudes and a changeover of ideas. However, the park continues to be important to the African American community, as evidenced in the double naming of the park. That's it.
All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it back to Brian, and we are going to go into the discussion part of tonight's event.
All right, so full disclosure, Jocelyn and I go back about a decade or so when she came into the Park Service as a fresh-faced intern while doing her PhD studies at Howard. So
yes, indeed.
Yeah, so this conversation sounds like a couple of folks catching up is that's probably why.
Exactly.
But I'm going to try to stick to the script, and we'll start with the question. So the first question we are going to pose is, why is Meridian Hill also known as Malcolm X Park? Where did this name come from, and how is it connected to the legacy of community action in the space? And we heard a little bit about that, but I'd like you to try to maybe expand on that.
So that name, nobody officially knows where it came from. We know about the time that it developed. It comes just somewhere, it starts bubbling up in where we see written by 69. But we know that on the ground, in the period after Malcolm X's assassination in 65, and definitely after Martin Luther King's assassination in 68, Black Washingtonians start calling it Malcolm X Park. The clearest origins that I've seen are tying back to the Black United Front. But that's, the Black United Front is possibly just the people who kick off the name. But really, it's Black Washingtonians who are reclaiming their own space that name it Malcolm X Park. And even now today, the reason why most of us, well, I'm not a Black Washingtonian anymore, but I very rarely refer to Meridian Hill Park by that name. It's because of that cultural legacy.
Sure. So I think about being a relatively young man and going and hanging out there. And, the first time someone said to me Meridian Hill Park, I'm like, what are you all talking about? They're like, oh, you mean this place? Oh, that has another name other than Malcolm X Park.
Right.
And the urban myth for me that I'd always heard was that Angela Davis coined the phrase when she was there, I think at African Liberation Day one year, that she coined the phrase, but I've seen the same, but I've also read the same references you have to the Black United Front and other individuals who've been responsible for that. But it's interesting because, the name, the name Malcolm X Park sticks. And at the same time, Meridian Hill, the idea of that being on, at the precipice of the, prime meridian of Washington, D.C., and what the sort of cultural connections that infers. You have the 33 and the third degree Masons right down the street, right on 16th, right on 16th Street. There are all kinds of connections to multiple, I would say, cultural lineages that occur in this place. So, Meridian Hill is significant in and of itself. And the fact that, it also gets buttressed with, Malcolm X Park, I think it makes I think it makes it interesting. And I also think I also will say that the fact that people feel comfortable using them interchangeably, because let's be clear, people thought that Meridian Hill was a bad name or didn't have some sort of resonance to it, they wouldn't use it. I mean, so.
Right. No, I think you're right. And I think I remember that DCS poll a few years back. I remember that conversation about, do you call it Malcolm X or Meridian Hill, and the unfolding. I think what's also happened, so there's the origins of the name in the late 60s, early 70s in the Black Power movement. And then there's the retention of the name through time and space. And I think now in the contemporary moment, Meridian Hill I'll say the people who call it Malcolm X do it much. I think the same people who refuse to call Malcolm X Meridian Hill are the same people who want the music, the go-go at 7th and Florida Avenue. I think it's now this other thing other than what it became, what it was when it started.
Sure. All right. Next question. Why is Meridian Hill considered Black Ground Zero? Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
I've never heard that phrase. However, I would say that I think, looking back and thinking even in prepping for this panel, I ended up going back over resources that I studied in my dissertation. And I'm thinking about how many things are proximate to this park and the geographical placement of this park. Because church, I don't want to mess with the church, St. Stephen, the Church of St. Stephen. What's the name of the church? It's near All Souls. It's up there.
Oh, you're talking about St. Stephen's Church up on 16th near Newton. Yeah.
That church and All Souls are two of the churches that are really involved during the mid-century, protest movements. Those are some spaces that are home. Then as you get a little later, thank you, St. Stephen's and the Incarnation Episcopal. Exactly. That's right up the street. Then Howard University is just a little east. And when you think about Drummond Spear Bookstore, the Center for Black Education, those were not too far. 14th and U is just down the hill. And then if you're marching, the White House is straight down 16th Street. So I think it becomes a staging ground because of its proximity. And also the other thing that I think about when I think about DC is space and the lack thereof. Because there's not, if you want to gather a couple hundred people together in the heart of the city, where are you taking them? There's not a lot of places. The National Mall is an option, but that, as you well know, is an extensive permitting process, and it's logistically complicated for a resident to get down there. And Rock Creek Park is too far west. I can't think of any other spaces other than Malcolm X Park that are aptly situated for ad hoc community gatherings like that. So I think that's how it becomes that way.
I think there's something to, the proximate space, proximate location to other communities. And I think community is part of the conversation, right? So in many ways, when people talk about Meridian Hill, Malcolm X Park, they talk about it like it's a third space in this community. So, and it's a third space, not just for the African Americans who were in Columbia Heights, but for the Latinos who were there, for the,
absolutely,
for the folks across in Adams Morgan and places like that, because it's green space. I mean, one thing that the Park Service does provide for the city of Washington, D.C. is ample green space. And if you need to get a few hundred people together somewhere in an open space, Meridian Hill is a great place to do it. It's high ground. It's relatively dense. It's relatively densely populated. There's a bus that runs like water up and down 16th Street if you need to get somewhere. So I mean, transportation being a piece of it, right? But I was doing a little bit of reading, and the idea that dating back to the 30s and 40s, what they would call the pre-civil rights era, and then into the civil rights era, and then the quote unquote post-civil rights era, that Meridian Hill keeps being a place where people come to, and where people decide that if we're going to make a statement, if we're as a community, as a local community, make a statement, this is a place, right? Stokely Carmichael, when he sets up shop, he's in Meridian Hill. You know, Dick Gregory, when he comes through DC, he's in Meridian Hill. Dr. King had been to Meridian Hill previously.
Meridian Hill, yeah.
I believe one of the proposed marches that Philip Randolph wanted to do was staging
it's supposed to organize, yes,
and walk down to the White House. You know, that vantage point.
The vantage point, and I want to just like, as I'm thinking through that area. Now, of course, by the time I came to DC, it was a little bit different than Stokely Carmichael's day. But I honestly can't think of any other public space that's anywhere nearby. I mean, I'm like traveling in the map. There's that pinch of a park up in Petworth, but there's nothing like it. Yeah, it's a gym.
Well, yeah, it's everything, right? I mean, it's, you know, it provides, you know, it's funny. I was walking through there a couple of weeks ago, and you know, there is a group that provides meals and provides foodstuffs to people in the community. They're there weekly, and as I'm watching these people queue up, and as I'm seeing, you know, people get set, I'm just looking around, and just the number of people in the middle of the day. Now I realize we're coming out of COVID. And therefore, you know, more people are having access to that park in extended times than probably ever before. But it's amazing to me to look at the number of people that were there, the breadth of diversity that was in that space, and yet, you know, in many ways, it still sits right there, you know, at the northern edge and at the western edge of a really sizable African-American, what had been a very robust African-American community. There used to be a seminary right in that location at one point. So yeah, I think I do think when you think about the confluence of an large educational venue, the number of churches and activist churches that, you know, literally abut there, it makes all the sense in the world that as the city of Washington, D.C., and as the country is going through this transition, you know, post World War II, that if you need that as a place to organize, it makes the most that
it's there.
Yeah, it's right.
And I mean,
there.
and I think there's also I know we got to move on, but I also think there's something about the familiarity of the space, right? Like when you're in, it's not hard to call an audible and say, meet in Malcolm X Park because everybody knows where that is. Meet in Meridian Hill because everybody knows where that is. We go on the top or we go to the bottom. Like everybody knows once you're in the community. And I think that's an important piece too.
Sure, absolutely. So I think we spoke a little bit about this in this discussion, but what kind of organizing took place in Meridian Hill Park during the civil rights era? Given your background in African diaspora, I would love for you to speak a little bit to the different confluence of peoples who wound up, you know, using that space, particularly at the time when the Pan-African movement is, you know, really bubbling up. And Washington's a central place for that.
I think we talked about proximity. It's also proximate to those embassies, right? And so as African liberation movements are popping up across the continent of Africa, Meridian Hill, Malcolm X Park becomes a great staging area to express alliance and support for those movements, and also when necessary to march on embassies of countries. Like, this is a little after the strong liberation movement of the 70s, but that famous South African Embassy March in 76. I mean, it's not the same as the early 70s, but in 76, when Black Americans and other people of the African diaspora are protesting apartheid, it's meet in Malcolm X, Meridian Hill Park, and let's march over to the South African Embassy because it's not that far, right? I think also Malcolm X is something about the claiming of the space in the name of Malcolm X And I think there's a direct correlation to the idea of finishing um, Malcolm X's legacy, right? That when Malcolm was murdered, he was working on Pan-Africanism. He was working on broadening our scope. So both Malcolm X Day and African Liberation Day, All African People's Revolutionary Party, Black United Front, all of these Panthers, all of these Black nationalists, but it's not just Black nationalism, Black and Pan-African internationalists and other forms of Black organizers are all keeping their eyes toward Africa and doing this organizing in the name of Malcolm. And it just makes sense that, again, it's all staged there. There's also what fascinates me, again, just thinking about proximity, is the labor organizing that happens, because, again, how far is the AFL-CIO building from this park? It's very close. So there's that labor. And I think it, because of that early demonstration around African liberation, Black nationalism, that park just becomes home to any number of causes, any number of anything, because it becomes again, going back to the question of space, right? It's difficult to find space for you to organize your activists, your organizers, without a lot of hassle, a lot of trouble. So once it's seen that Malcolm X is a safe space and is a home to an activist community, I think you see all manner of causes, like Elise mentioned in her video, Trayvon Martin, and I had read in the reading, there was an African Americans against the Gulf War, and even, down, we can get into the cultural aspects, but I think about some of the organizing moments I've been in at that park. And I want to get to the cultural space, we'll get there later, but yeah, it starts with African liberation and becomes kind of everything.
Thanks. So the next question, actually, we talked about this at this a couple of different times already, but what role does the park's proximity to 16th Street play in serving as a hub to social activism?
Yeah, I think we mentioned its proximity to churches and sites of power. I think its accessibility to college students can't be understated as well. Those college students, particularly those freshmen and sophomores who are not bogged down with activities but probably don't have a car or money, can walk from Howard. They can walk from, they probably wouldn't walk from GW, but they might. It's not far. Everybody can get there. And it's in the heart of the city. And now with the metro, not too far from there either, it's really accessible. And I think that, I'm still thinking of where else in the city can you gather a couple hundred people. Fort DuPont is too far east. Anacostia Park is too far southeast. The mall it's the nation's park. It's not really a city park. Mm-hmm. So, although I guess it might be, but then Rock Creek is too far west. So it really is Meridian Hill. Mm-hmm. And I can't even think of DPR owned sites that have the space capacity of a Meridian Hill. It's just that it's in the heart of the city. I think that it's what makes it accessible to everybody.
So something I would say along those lines of not only the size of it, but also the accessibility of it. So much Washington, D.C. is basically a First Amendment space. And if you have fewer than 25 people, you gather with very few exceptions on public land, you can gather almost anywhere. But there are places that allow you to be able to pull 400, 500 people together and not have a permit. And the thing I think is very interesting is how people learn about how these spaces, where these spaces are and where these spaces exist. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's striking to me about Meridian Hill and 16th Street is that with 16th Street being the through line, that used to be the old trolley car line that used to run from downtown to bring people up to Mount Pleasant when that was a suburb of Washington, D.C. And then you've had this settlement along 16th Street, and then you have this place for the people, that, you know, it's a public park. It started out to be a public park. It's owned by the Park Service now, but it's still a public park. The expectation is that wherever the people would gather, that is a space for that. And that is, it makes sense. And this, I'm not saying it very well, but there's something to be said about it being in the middle of these 2 or 3 very densely populated communities, and its accessibility, and the fact that these are communities that are engaged in multiple conversations. I mean, you mentioned the churches. I'm thinking about the Latin American Youth Center that got settled right up the street.
Yes, I love
60s,
LAYC.
Yeah, late 60s, early 70s, when Native American nations did the longest walk. Their final location in 78, was it July 1978, July 15, 78, was they walked past the White House to Meridian Hill, because that's sacred space, because that was a place of power and religious importance to many people, and then made their descent back down to the White House to do their protesting and things of that nature. But it was necessary to come to that space first. And I think about community being, you know, not just the people who live around here, but the people who identify with that. The fact that that group was like, no, we need to go there because other people who are in a struggle are using this space as a place of gathering, as a place of healing, as a place of respite. We need to touch upon that. And by the way, we got roots here too.
Yes. Yes.
So, all right. So what type of cultural activities were held in the park after the Civil Rights era, and how are they continuing those traditions today?
Man, that's such a huge question. I'll be brief because there's so many things. I think, you know, we know about the drum circle. I think Elise adequately hit on the drum circle, but that, I think, gives birth and gives space to all manner of festivals, big and small. Right? There's a bevy of them that are that are mentioned, but I want to focus on more recent times, because something that I don't think is mentioned. One of my most poignant moments at Malcolm X Park was that we gathered there after Nipsey Hussle was murdered. And for those who don't know, Nipsey Hussle is a phenomenal hip hop artist, businessman, community organizer, source of inspiration, just a light amongst people, a light. And he was living in Los Angeles, California. That's where he's from. And he was gunned down in front of his store that he built. He was buying his own hood, built a store, was gunned down in front of it. It was a really tragic thing that happened a few years ago. And anybody who knew who he was and knew what he was building and saw how he was cut down, it was a really impactful moment. And Nipsey was Eritrean, so he's Habesha as well as African American. And that moment of this particular gathering at Malcolm X Park, it was so, the Nation of Islam were there, and all of these Habesha folks, the Ethiopians and the Eritreans were there, and hip hop heads of all generations were there, because we were all so sad. But in that sadness, we looked around at who else was there, and there was this, I'm struggling to find the words. All that's coming to my mind is this understanding that the marathon continues. And TMC, the marathon continues, is part of Nipsey Hussle's whole thing. So in this moment of deep, deep grief, Malcolm X is the space that holds us, where we look around, right? Just that is one of the highlights, but there's festivals. Another thing that I'll shamelessly plug, Next Fest DC happens in Malcolm X Park.
I was wondering when you were going to get
there. I was going to get there. I have my main job, but I have a side hat as the humanities director for Next Fest DC, nextfestdc.com. And that one is really, I'm really proud of that work. I am one on the team. It's a dream that came out of Capital Bop. That's Giovanni Rossinello and Luke Stewart. And they've built something. They knew that Malcolm X Park had to be the place because of that long lineage. I mean, all of the festivals, all of the cultural actions that have happened there, all of the political organizing there, Malcolm X Park had to be the place. And it has been the place. We just had our second festival, second annual festival about a month ago, 3 weeks ago. What is time? It was in September. And what we found last year, when we built it last year, I mean, it's one of the first things back from the pandemic. We had no idea how people would receive it. It was kind of a toss up. And what we found was people were so excited to hear the music coming out of Malcolm X Park again that so many people just piled. It was like the end of the Wiz when they were breaking out. Can't you feel a brand new day? It was like that. Versus this year, what we found is that word traveled. Whoever couldn't make it last year knew about it, was looking forward to it, was excited. And so now we continue to do this work. I can't begin to name all of the cultural things that have happened in this park because there's so many. Those are just two I highlight. And maybe we can get to some more in question and answer. But that's something that comes to mind.
So something I wanted to, this is a little bit off of our line of questioning, but I'm thinking about how the space is used and it being a First Amendment space, a space for demonstrations, a cultural space and things of that nature. And I think a fascinating thing is periodically, every 20, 30 years, someone decides that I'm not happy with all that music, with all that sound, or with all these things taking place in this community or in this park. And some of it, I'm sure, has to do with demographic changes. Some of it has to do with, there are lots of reasons why, right? But, coming up, like they used to do more performances, live performances and things in the 40s and the 30s and 40s. Then at some point it was like, hey, we don't want that anymore, right? And then, that changes in the 60s, and start doing more performances, start doing more cultural events, start doing more of those things. Then there are complaints again. Hey, noise, keep this down. Maybe we shouldn't be doing these sorts of things here. It's disturbing me. As Elise mentioned in her presentation, in the early aughts, someone decided that Malcolm X, the drum circle's too loud. Maybe they need to move that. I don't understand why they're doing that. And it's funny how these things crop up periodically, and in some ways, it's tied to, I think there's a weird thing that happens when people move into neighborhoods that are known to have an active social component to it, and then decide that they're not interested in that active social component being there anymore. I think that's fascinating. So
I'm like, you could have moved to Deanwood, you could have moved to Chevy Chase, go to Arlington, friends. Like, there's so many other places. If you don't want to be loud, why would you move to a loud part of town? Because even if there's no drumming, there's still taxis and sirens and other things. Like, that's a very active part of the city. If you don't want to be there, if you don't want to be loud, go to the quiet parts. There's plenty way up at work. I'm thinking basically any of the edges of the district are much quieter than the heart of the district. All welcome to be purchased. I don't know why you move into a space and complain about how it functions. It's wild.
Yeah, I think I find as I was thinking about that, I was like, so you moved into a place where activism of all types occurs. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't have the right to go into their houses and close their doors and be able to enjoy quiet. But I think about how invigorating it was for me when I used to I lived in Adams Morgan, and I lived in Mount Pleasant before I moved up to Petworth. And, the whole idea that, I don't have anything to do today. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to walk over
outside
because something is happening. Something's happening. Something's taking place. And the idea that you would move into a community like that and not be attracted to that, I find to be weird. Anyway,
Tacoma Park is waiting for you.
Yeah. Tacoma but Tacoma Park is a alive and active community, right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
so
Maybe
yeah.
they want to go to Falls Church. I don't know. But let's continue. Let's move on.
We beat this horse to death. So which activists have had a historic connection to Meridian Hill Malcolm X Park? We've talked about a couple.
There's so many. I think I want to lift up. We talked about Davis and I mean, there's so many, but I want to highlight some of those local folks. I mean, we have right in our midst, Nkechi Tayefa is a giant amongst people, the lawyer for the movement, and she has a fantastic book which I'll make sure is sent out. Talks about her life in the life in organizing struggle. We have Baba Lumumba and all of these like folks there are those national names, but there's and we've lifted up a lot of those national names, but there's a lot of local folks that it's their organizing and their agitation that has made the Washington, D.C. that we know now possible. I don't want to get into the trap of naming names because I'm going to forget somebody, but those two come to mind as some to definitely hold up.
So one of the things that crossed my mind around that topic was the number of people affiliated with Howard University who maybe went to
HU?
Yeah.
And it's homecoming, so I'm extra hyped. But continue.
Oh, I got you. But the number of people who either were professors there, and I had the fortune of getting to know E. Ethelbert Miller years ago.
Yes.
When I thought I wanted to be a writer. He was kind enough to entertain my silly dalliances, but knowing how long he was at that school, his engagement with a lot of the early cultural and political activity that wound up taking place, not just at Howard University, but spilling into Malcolm X Park, Meridian Hill. I think about that. You think about the fact that Pauli Murray is a law student at Howard University, and she's involved in activities here in Washington, D.C., here at Meridian Hill Park at different points. And your point about the number of people, local people who make it possible for Washington to be the Washington that it is today, right? Who don't always shine quite as brightly and burn so as brightly as other people. For every Marion Barry, there's 4 other people who
there's a Wilson. There's a John Wilson.
H.R. Crawford, Sterling Tucker, all these individuals.
I'm thinking about the founders of Nation House and lift up Baba. I'm having a brain fart, but Mama Kuya and the Okotos from Nation House, and there's so many other folks that their organizing, their agitation, their institution building made it possible for this DC. Yes, for sure.
So a name I want to mention, Dick Gregory.
May he rest in peace and power.
And the thing that was always fascinating to me about Dick Gregory is like Dick Gregory was famous for decades when he decided, he makes a huge lifestyle change in becoming a vegetarian. He decides to come to DC to live, and I don't know how much of this is apocryphal, and maybe some of the people, when we open this up for question and answer, maybe there might be some folks on here to speak to this, but I vaguely remember when I was a kid, Dick Gregory doing sleep-ins in the park to advocate, for the unsheltered, to advocate for better treatment for people who had drug addiction, who were unfortunately at the time using the park on a fairly regular basis. So I thought about him because, this is somebody who makes a whole lifestyle change, and he decides that the place he's going to do his work is here. And one of the places he was doing that work was at Malcolm X Park. So
I think he's a man of the people, and he knew the people were at Malcolm X Park. And so he was going to find the people, which I think also speaks to the power of that park, that like you knew, and other people know that even this Saturday, you can go. Heck, tomorrow, you can go. If you want to find the people, they're right there.
Sure.
Yeah.
So one more question, and I think we're gonna make some time to hear from
Q&A.
other people. I know Tony has been monitoring the chat for questions, and I've seen some comments. Haven't had a chance to monitor them, but looking forward to that. In addition to Black African American communities, how have other communities used the space for organizing?
We talked about the labor folks. I think that I know that there's a lot of Spanish-speaking folks that utilize that park. And I'm also, you may know this better than me, but isn't the park a site for a lot of LGBTQ organizing as well?
There have been.
I believe so, because I'm just thinking in my own just memory, like I've heard of marches and stuff. I think the same reason that it's attractive to African Americans in the late 60s and early 70s is why it becomes attractive to all the other populations that begin to fill DC in mass. And so I would not be surprised. I don't know. Do you know if have there been any Ukrainian demonstrations there? Because I wouldn't be surprised if there were.
So I have to say, I don't recall there being any, let's put it this way, I don't recall there being any formal demonstrations.
Right, because about a third of the demonstrations at the park are actually formal. Most people just pull up. Most people just show up there. But yeah, I think it's become a home to everybody who calls DC home. Which, of course, is changing demographics every day.
Oh, absolutely. No more questions, but one thing I always I find interesting is Central Presbyterian Church sits right up there, about 15th in Irving, and it was for a while. It was I think the Wilson Center was the home for LAYC. Other groups have organized there over the course of years, and that church was the home church for Woodrow Wilson. So, whose dad had been a Presbyterian minister during the Civil War.
I didn't know that.
With the Confederacy, which is why he wound up growing up in Virginia. And, Wilson wound up growing up in Virginia and Augusta, Georgia. But I always found that striking because when I found this out, I was doing some research for a graduate class, and at the time, a charter school had just purchased the building and was doing all these renovations. And it's a charter school full of little brown and Black kids, kids speaking about 7 to 8 different languages. And I went in one day years ago to talk to the 4th grade class, and I asked them if they knew who Woodrow Wilson was. And, we talked about League of Nations. We talked about, They did not.
Did they know? I was going to say 4th graders.
No, so what I'll say is that they knew enough to ask a question. So they had been prepared. So we talked a little bit about it, and then I said, so why would he go to church here when he was down at the White House down on 16th Street? And they're like, maybe it's the closest church, and I was like, no, that's not it. And then I start saying, it's like, so you go to church and you go spend time in places where you have community, right? And Mount Pleasant had been filled with government employees, a lot of who came from over near, which Union Station, a neighborhood used to be called Swamp Poodle, and things like that, as more ethnic whites, brown and Black people moved in those neighborhoods. They moved over to here, and they created Central Presbyterian, which is the Southern Presbyterian Church. So, and it's obviously it's a good sized church, and it was large enough to have a congregation for the business end of 100 years before finally, it finally ended. But I was asking about what does it mean to have a church in your community? Does everyone here go to some sort of religious institution in their community. And some of them did. And some of them didn't go to church at all, or go to synagogue or mosque at all. And some of them were like, no, well, my grandmother goes out here. It's like, and so like community moves.
Yes.
But there's the fact that there have been multiple communities in that area along that meridian connected to that park.
That are not forgetting that park, because they all feel, no matter if they physically moved, that park is home.
And those kids, where did they go to play when it's time to go play? They went to that park. That
park, yeah. That's beautiful. I saw the question in the chat of that you actually know the answer to. Because you read the land acknowledgement about the sacred space for Native Americans.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tony and let him facilitate
he does it.
This piece, and then we'll get started, and then we'll answer the questions.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. What a rich discussion. So we have one question that's come in. Also, please, audience members, if you have any questions, if you have any comments for our participants, please type those out in the chat, and we will try and get those questions answered. So our first question actually came in through the registration, and it asks, is MPS, this is probably for Brian, is MPS receptive at all to incorporating more historical markers at Malcolm X Park?
So, historical markers are difficult to add to any federal land, particularly in Washington, D.C., because of the Commemorative Works Act. So it literally takes an act of Congress to add a historic markers, or if you want to add some sort of statue or something of that nature, it literally takes an act of Congress to do it. So if you can garner that sort of support with the congressional delegation to put something forward, and they can get it through both houses, then yes, we would be obligated to do so. But I will say that we don't go out of our way to put more stuff in Meridian Hill Park. We are pretty happy with the statuary we have there. And we're, folks who live in the area know that we've been working on the lower plaza and trying to get that taken care of, and landscaping, and working on the fountain. So yeah, it would literally take an act.
And isn't the reason why the name was never changed because of the statue that's in there?
There's a presidential statue, and I forget what the other statue is, but because those statues are in there, and now the park has an association with the president, even though his name is not on there, that made it difficult to change the name. That made it, at least the reading at the time, that we would not be able to change the name.
Right. And I just want to say, before you answer that, pitch the next question, to the audience, please consider the historical markers, that you make sure that historical markers are the right way to go. Because a lot of times folks want to erect the marker or the statue, but they're not thinking about upkeep and long-term things. And so we might have a statue that looks yucky in 5 years because the materials weren't done. Just shameless plug for that.
Great, thank you. And please, everyone in the audience, if you have some questions, type them out in the chat. This question came from Kathy M, and she said, you all touched on this just briefly, but she said, I've heard stories of the park being a sacred space for Native Americans from way back. Then many Black folks lived nearby and used the park space later. Any info about this? And I was thinking, Dr. Amani, if you wanted to maybe speak to this question. I know you shared a little bit about your work with Capital Bop and Next Fest, but do you want to elaborate on the ways in which you are honoring Native land through that festival?
Oh yeah, I could talk about that and then tag Brian, because we got him. So yeah, it was really important for us with Next Fest to not just honor the cultural and political roots in the contemporary moment, but to think about that ancestral land. As the zeitgeist is changing and more Americans are understanding the depth of the theft of the land that we all inhabit, it was important for us as a multiracial group. We are mostly just Black and white, but a multiracial group of organizers to honor those Native peoples that existed before us. So last year, that's something that we talked about. We wanted that libation and land acknowledgement, but we weren't able to execute it last year. But this year, with an assist from, we got the land acknowledgement from the National Shrines of Africans in America, Mama Abajua. She did our libation. And then we had our friends at the Park Service do the land acknowledgement. And so, yeah, it's really important. And I'll just tap in, Brian, because can you just speak about that NCR, the National Capital Region's land acknowledgement and the origin of that?
Sure. As land acknowledgements have become more and more common, particularly in large public gatherings or when the Park Service is engaging with communities, the National Capital Region began looking and saying, okay, how do we come up with something that is sincere and yet acknowledges that we don't know exactly who was here. We have an idea about the different ethnic groupings. We know, so we've been talking here this whole time, and I'm assuming everyone understands this, but I'm going to say this. So Meridian Hill Park is one of the parks within Rock Creek Park. Rock Creek Park is the larger administrative park. If you think about Rock Creek as the kind of big green wedge in the northern portion of the city of Washington, D.C., there's that piece, and that's the biggest piece, Reservation 339. But we have literally 99 other parcels of land throughout most of Northwest and some of North and Northeast. And Meridian Hill is one of those parcels. It's a large parcel, and it's a very significant one. So if you talk about the Anacostan people, which is kind of a derivation of the Natchitoches people, or at least the pronunciation of it, a lot of those folks stayed closer to where the water was. So they were near the Potomac, they were near the Anacostia River, and they came into Rock Creek. There were very active quarries and the hunting, but they spent most of their time close to the water. So the highland where we are would have been a foraging place, where Meridian Hill would have been a foraging place. And I'll share with you the land acknowledgement that I shared at Next Fest. So let us begin by acknowledging that we are in the territory of many indigenous peoples that have known the Potomac Valley and its lands and waters as their homeland for thousands of years to the present day, including the Algonquin, Iroquois, and Siouan peoples. We're just beginning our engagement with traditionally associated Native American communities to identify all of the different connections that these lands held by many Native nations. Together, we recognize the Native nations' past, present, and future unbroken and unbreakable connection to these lands. We honor their resilience and perseverance of these nations, even as colonizers claim this land as their own. So that is the land acknowledgement that we are using in the National Capital Region, which should all the parks in Washington, D.C., the Maryland suburbs, and out to even West Virginia, like Harper's Ferry, places like that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it might have been a little
just a little bit of a science nerd thing, because to Brian's point, there is a move to do land acknowledgements all the way around. Kind of everybody wants to do that. It is very difficult. Well, number one, land acknowledgements are just a first step in terms of public lands and public engagement, audience engagement, really understanding that in correcting and atoning for what has been done wrong, there is a conversation about not just acknowledging that this is your land, but if we're stewarding the lands, figuring out how do we offer the resources of the land to the people who are ancestrally, have ancestral claim to it. There's also a conversation about engaging beyond just saying, hey, this is your land. What does that look like? This is an evolving conversation in the field of public land management that's happening in agencies across the country. And one of the biggest challenges is how do you research who was there? when you look at when the theft of the land happened, intentional disruption of memory also happened. So it's not, so to the question about like sacred space, I don't know the answer, but I also know why I don't know the answer. So that's part of our challenge, is to figure out and recover what we don't know.
Excellently said. Very well said. And thank you all for sharing both of those. I know I am also, I wear another hat as well. I am a board member for the Partnership for the National Trail System. And this is something that we have also been sort of working through. And yeah, I just really, really appreciate you adding that. So yeah, with that, it looks like we don't have any other questions in the chat. So it looks like we may be ending just a few minutes early tonight, but I just wanted to pass it back. Mr. Joyner, Dr. Amani, if you all have any final thoughts to share just before I wrap up and close us out for the night.
I'll just say, first and foremost, thank you. It's a Wednesday night and you're on Zoom and you could be anywhere. So the fact that you're on this Zoom talking about this park means that you care and that you're engaged, and citizen stewards is so necessary for the survival and the thriving of public lands. So number one, thank you. But number two, I implore you to continue to get engaged. The conversation about Rock Creek Park or Malcolm Marx Park or any of the DC conversations can sometimes get really, really insular and local, as opposed to thinking about how these conversations are being tracked at sites across the country. I'm sitting in my day job, I sit in a national seat, and I'm often privy to conversations with local organizations about their public lands that mirror this one. So please continue to steward, continue to get engaged, but also, few people have just one city that we're connected to. There may be your city that your mom's from, or your city your dad's from, or that place you went to college. Tap in on those public lands too. You don't have to necessarily get involved on being the boards, but think about, pay attention to the conversations that are happening, because within this larger world of public lands management, there is a move to recover and to remember that which we lost, and want you, Mr., Mrs., non-binary person on the other side of this computer, to be engaged in that work. So thank you, and please continue to work with us.
So yeah, I appreciate everyone who took the time to be here. I'm still relatively new to Rock Creek Park, but I'm not new to the Park Service. And a lot of the work I did prior to coming into Rock Creek Park was around working with diverse communities and having conversations around what are the impacts on the built environment. And what is the impact of the built environment on them? So when you think about a city like Washington, DC, with all of its, shall we say, overlay of people and power and politics and the number of embassies that run through here, we wind up in a place where there's a richness to what sort of interactions we have with people in the city and our public lands, these places that the National Park Service holds, but that the city holds. I mean, these are places where we engage. These are really the places where I think as society starts to look for, where can we have common ground? Where can we have third spaces? Where can we engage? Where can we meet each other? I think public lands, I think parks, I think urban, particularly in urban spaces where you have this sort of green space, these are the places where our differences matter less and less, and our humanity matters more and more. So thank you all for coming out. I appreciate you all taking the time. Jocelyn, you and I can catch up anytime, but this is a good way to do it as well. And I just want to say, Rock Creek Conservancy, these Race History in Rock Creek webinars are an amazing opportunity for not just people like me to get involved and be able to do some moderation, things of that nature, but to really kind of talk about how these different aspects of our lives really intersect in this incredible resource that you all are one of our best partners in regard to stewarding. So thank you, Tony. Thank you, Romy. Thank you, Jeannie. I appreciate everything you all do.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's fantastic. I'm definitely not going to be able to top either of those final remarks. So I will just say thank you again to our moderator, Brian Joyner, and our participants, Dr. Jocelyn Amani, as well as Elise Norquist, who couldn't be here in person. I also want to thank all of you for attending. Again, this event was recorded, and everyone that registered will automatically receive a link to the recording. We'll send that out sometime tomorrow. Now, also, if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please be sure to check out the Rock Creek Conservancy website to access the library of archived past events. I just dropped a link to our Race History in Rock Creek page in the chat, where you can see all of those past events that have happened there. And again, just a final thank you for attending tonight's Race History in Rock Creek. And please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Tony Richardson. I am the Senior Manager of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at the Conservancy. And if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, please feel free to reach out to me. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your evening, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Brian.
You're welcome.
I'll talk to you in the morning.
Okay, good night.
Bye.
Thanks for doing this important work, people. I love
Thanks
it.
for being here with us.
Thank you very much.